Hello, and welcome to the Fiction Nonfiction podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your social media feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm Vivi Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, author of the novel Brotherless Night.
And I'm Whitney Terrell, author of the novel The Good Lieutenant. Remember those Halloween episodes we used to do comparing the potential terrors of a Trump administration to horror movies? I feel like this was the week where at least one of those horror scripts made it through development and became real.
I assume you're talking about the murder of Minnesota State Rep Melissa Hortman and her husband, along with the shooting of State Senator John Hoffman and his wife, Yvette.
I am. But I'm really talking about the picture of the alleged killer, Vance Bolter, at the door of one of the victims' homes. In, I think it's a mask. Surely you saw this.
I saw this. It's absolutely terrifying. There's something so it is like something out of a horror movie.
And I know this is stupid because you're not a politician and because I should be concerned about the real people who were allegedly shot by this guy. Well, they were shot. But I immediately thought about him knocking at your door. I don't mean to give you nightmares, but I was scared for you.
I don't know if I should say thank you for that image or not.
I apologize. But in the age of masked ICE and DHS agents, this avatar of death feels like it could come to anybody's door. It's insane to imagine that anyone is safe, especially if they're in the public eye. State representatives and senators one day, podcasters the next.
No doubt. But fortunately, no one has knocked at my door in a horror mask yet. But we are going to talk about what happened here in Minneapolis with Ernesto Londoño, who has been covering the story for the New York Times. Ernesto is the author of Trippy, The Promise and Perils of Medicinal Psychedelics. He previously worked at the Washington Post, where his assignments included covering the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, Arab Spring, and the Pentagon. He joined the New York Times as an editorial writer and then served as the newspaper's Brazil bureau chief in Rio de Janeiro. In early 2022, he moved to St. Paul, Minnesota, where he writes for the New York Times national desk. Ernesto, welcome to the show. No doubt. But fortunately, no one has knocked at my door in a horror mask yet. So we're going to talk about what has happened here in Minneapolis with Ernesto Londoño, who has been covering the story for the New York Times. Ernesto is the author of Trippy, The Promise and Perils of Medicinal Psychedelics. And he previously worked at the Washington Post, where his assignments included covering the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, Arab Spring, and the Pentagon. He joined the New York Times as an editorial writer and has served as the newspaper's Brazil bureau chief in Rio de Janeiro. In early 2022, he moved to St. Paul, Minnesota, where he writes for the New York Times national desk. Ernesto, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. We're going to start with the victims in this discussion. These shootings occurred early on Saturday, June 14th. Who were they, and what do we know about them prior to these shootings as human beings, not just politicians?
Sure. Yeah. So two individuals were killed in these shootings. There was a broad plan to target Democratic lawmakers and abortion providers, but two people died. The most high-profile individual was Representative Melissa Hortman, who had served recently as Speaker of the Minnesota House. Representative Hortman was a veteran lawmaker and was very well known in political circles here. She was a lawyer by training and was known as a moderate suburban Democrat and somebody who was really skilled at reaching across the aisle, finding common ground with Republicans. We know from a personal standpoint, she was really passionate about the environment. She loved dogs and would often foster and train dogs to serve as working dogs. And she was very devoted to her husband, Mark, who worked for a local company that makes electric appliances and is involved in finding kind of new technologies for clean energy. Her husband was also killed in the attack, as was their beloved golden retriever, Gilbert. The other two people who were shot in the early hours of Sunday were Senator John Hoffman, another Democrat in the Capitol, and his wife, Yvette. And the two of them survived, although they were wounded very seriously.
So, can you describe to us, kind of based on the available reporting, what exactly happened when Vance Bolter came to their doors?
Yeah, I think we're getting a clearer picture of the chronology of these very, very chaotic and very scary events. But in the early hours of Saturday, around 2 p.m., a man drives up to the home of Senator Hoffman, who lives in
Wait, hold
Champlin.
on. I'm going to stop you. You said 2 p.m., but I think you meant 2 a.m.
Okay, let me start again. 3, 2, 1. Yeah, we're starting to get a clear chronology of these very chaotic and very scary events that unfolded in the early hours of Saturday. So the first thing we know is that shortly after 2 a.m., a man drives up to the home of Senator Hoffman, who lives in Champlin, which is a suburb of Minneapolis. He's driving an SUV that is outfitted with like special emergency lights. So, it looked like a police cruise vehicle. And he pounds on the door wearing a silicone mask that makes him look like an older, bald man. He's wearing also body armor and what appears to be a police uniform. So he pounds on the door, identifies himself as a law enforcement official. And inside that home were Senator Hoffman, his wife, Yvette, and their daughter, Hope. And apparently the three of them are really startled, go to the door, open the door, assuming this was in fact a police officer. And then when they have a closer look at him and they realize he's wearing a mask, they are startled and confused and confront him. And according to the federal indictment, Bolter at that point says this is a robbery or words to that effect. And then there's a physical confrontation. So apparently, John Hoffman lunges toward the gunman and in doing so gets shot multiple times. And then Yvette continues to push him out the door and apparently succeeds, but in doing so also gets struck by gunfire, apparently 8 bullet wounds. And it is ultimately their daughter, Hope, who apparently appears to close the lock on the door, races to grab the phone, and calls 911 to tell the authorities what has just happened.
And she's Hope. Well, we'll get to that in a minute. So this happens, but then he goes to the Hortmans. Is that right? Am I getting that correct?
There's a couple of
What's the
stops.
order?
Yeah, there's a couple of stops in between. So, after he leaves this house in Champlin, he appears to have traveled to Maple Grove, which is another nearby suburb, and goes to the house of another state lawmaker, also a Democrat. And that lawmaker was not home. Apparently, the family had been on vacation. So he presumably pounds on the door. Nobody, comes to the door, and eventually he walks away. He then travels to the home of a Senator Ann Rest, also a Democrat who lives in a suburb called New Hope. And here, something really interesting happens, which is that the New Hope Police Department, which has been alerted to the fact that Senator Hoffman has been attacked at his home, you have all these police departments essentially sending out cops to the residences of their local lawmakers in this area just to check on them and to kind of check whether this may be there may be a broader threat. And apparently this police officer locks eyes with the suspect and may have spooked him. So, nothing serious happens at this home of this senator. And then around 3:30 a.m., he manages to get to Representative Hortman's home, which is in Brooklyn Park. And here again, he intersects with a local police officer who is kind of doing a preemptive due diligence check to make sure the former Speaker of the House is safe. And here there's an exchange of gunfire with a police officer, but the suspect manages to get inside the home, shoots Mark, her husband, apparently kills the representative inside the home, and manages to escape through a back door before the police can catch him at the scene. What's crucial here is he leaves behind his vehicle at this point. So now the police know that they have a vehicle and some documents inside the vehicle that give them the first sense of who may have been behind these attacks.
I mean, that guy must have been incredibly determined because, he knows after that first attack, like people are, and he still keeps going. It's terrifying. Um, According to the Times, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz credited Hope Hoffman, who was the daughter in the very first shooting, with saving countless lives on that night. Who is she, and what did she do?
Yeah, we know she's a young woman who is a very vocal disability rights advocate. She herself was born with a disability. I think she has spina bifida, which is a condition where the spinal cord does not develop normally. So we know she's been outspoken. There's a video that she posted on social media of her speaking and being introduced by her father in the Capitol earlier this year when there was a debate about potential cuts to certain programs that may impact people with disabilities. But we have not heard directly from her. It does appear, though, that in this really chaotic and scary situation, she had the clarity of mind and the reflexes to lock the door, to get to a phone, to call the authorities. And then that phone call is what allows first responders to come to the home quickly and get the senator and his wife to a hospital where they're recovering. But also crucially, it's what puts local law enforcement officials on alert that something really unusual and really violent has happened, and that plants the seed initially in the early moments of this manhunt that there may be a more serious threat, that more people may be in harm's way. So this is why you have cops all around the Minneapolis area going proactively to check in on the homes of lawmakers. And it's why the gunman apparently loses the ability to just keep driving around town, stalking the targets that were on his list.
So, Ernesto, I was overseas when this happened, started getting a bunch of texts about it. And then when I started reading about it, one of the stories that emerged, and which I wonder if you can provide some clarity about, is that Yvette Hoffman leapt in front of her daughter and saved her life. But I'm not hearing that in the story that you're telling me now. Is that true? Is that sort of one of the urban legends that arises out of such a terrible situation?
I think that early report came from a nephew of the Hoffmans who posted on social media that Hope had been saved by his mother covering her. I think that social media post has been deleted. I have not been able to speak at length with the nephew who posted that account. And we got on Thursday night a statement from the Hoffmans describing what transpired in their home, and that specific detail was not included in this more detailed and kind of definitive account of how this unfolded from their vantage point. So, I mean, she may have shielded her in some way because she took a bunch of bullets, but we don't quite know exactly who was where and what action each of them took. And I'm not even sure, given kind of the way memory and trauma works, I'm not even sure that
Of course.
any of the individuals involved may have a really kind of clear and reliable recollection of where they were and what they did, and why Hope appears to have dodged bullets in this case.
And so there was a manhunt for a while going on here, right? Like, not only did this happen, but this person was on the loose. The No Kings protests were the following day, I think, and like that the morning after that. And we were advised, I think people across the country were advised, and specifically locals in Minnesota were advised, as this gunman was on the loose, not to go to these protests. And so my various chats, my Facebook posts, my Twitter feed is all lighting up with people saying, I've made the difficult decision not to go, like, fuck this, I'm going anyway. Like, I can think of no better thing I can do in solidarity with these people than go anyway. Can you describe for us a little bit, like, the timeline of the manhunt and sort of how this is intersecting with the atmosphere around No Kings?
Yeah, of course. So, in the early hours, once they find this guy's vehicle. They see there's a bunch of guns in there. They see there's documents where apparently there were dozens of names of lawmakers and addresses, names of abortion providers. So all of a sudden, the authorities come to believe there's, a broader plot at hand. Many people may be at risk. And then crucially, inside that vehicle, among these documents, there's a handful that say "No Kings" in big, bold letters. So this was kind of an allusion, presumably, to the theme of the nationwide rallies that were organized around the country on Saturday. That prompts the governor of Minnesota, Tim Walz, and the state police to issue a warning. And, they tell people kind of in the late morning hours or mid-morning hours on Saturday, we think it would be prudent if you all do not go to a rally. There's just too much uncertainty and there's too much danger with this gunman on the loose for people to be in harm's way. So I think the operating assumption then was, could this guy have intended to kind of make one last stand or kind of like make the rally the last crime scene where he could have opened fire in an area with many, many people? So there was an effort to get these rallies canceled at the last minute, and several across the state were, but crucially, the one in front of the Capitol was not canceled. And the organizers issued a somewhat defiant statement saying, we think of all days, it's really important for us to be loud and present and mobilize and show courage by turning out as we had intended. I drive up to the Capitol kind of expecting that maybe a few, really brave souls would, have heeded that, advice from the organizers. But I was pretty stunned to see thousands and thousands of people there. Many of them had heard about the attacks and were very kind of nervous and cognizant of the fact that there may be a threat. So they were kind of looking over their shoulder and there was a tense situation. But many people I spoke to just went there having not really watched the news or been alerted that there was a manhunt underway in the state. But it was a sight to behold. There were people who kind of like redrew their posters and their signs that they had intended to bring to the rally to honor Melissa Hortman and John Hoffman that, said we're here standing up for democracy and, honoring these lives and their public service. And there were elderly people in walkers. There were families with children. It was a really kind of moving and stoic moment.
So this is a tightly knit political world. I know that not all of these politicians knew each other, but they all live, they live in suburbs where like I recognize the names of all of these places. This is effectively like, this really is happening where I live, where you live. The Times reported that Bolter visited, all of these, had this list of potential targets, had visited these two other politicians. So how has this set of events, and the eventual, he was apprehended, how has all of this affected local communities?
I think people are really, really shaken. I went to a candlelight vigil in front of the Capitol on Wednesday, which would have been, just a couple of days after he had been taken into custody. I saw a lot of people crying. I saw a lot of local lawmakers that looked still shell-shocked, embracing constituents. And I think by and large, people seem to be at a loss for words. I think you have a couple of debates that are unfolding in the aftermath of this. On the one hand, I think local elected officials are grappling with how dangerous these jobs have become in an era where, on the one hand, you have social media that really amplifies the most vitriolic and angry voices and can easily make people to be targets of wrath, if not violence. And on the other hand, we have a nation awash in firearms, where it's really easy for somebody who has an axe to grind or who goes down a radicalization rabbit hole to be really, really dangerous, to have dozens of weapons to their name. So there's, I think, a question of like, how do we protect ourselves? And are these jobs worth this growing risk? And then I think there's a parallel debate about the tone of our political discourse and rhetoric in this era. And I think just rewinding the tape to kind of the onset of the Trump years, I think Trump redrew the rules of what was acceptable political discourse. And I think Democrats have really struggled with whether they want to, as Michelle Obama suggested years ago, when they go low, we go high, or do they want to fight fire with fire and kind of, meet some of these more foul-mouthed and provocative Republican politicians where they are in their tone and their rhetoric. So I think people are kind of recalibrating their assumptions of what makes the most sense to move beyond this really tense and arguably dangerous political moment we're in.
But speaking of weapons, I wanted to ask this, and I may have the shot numbers wrong. I'm doing this from memory. I don't have this part written down for me, but I thought that I remember reading that like the Hoffmans who survived, like one of them was shot 8 times, the other one was shot 9 times. Is that correct, number-wise?
Yeah.
So what kind of weapon is this guy holding that shoots that many times? Is he have a handgun that shoots that many times? I mean, that's a lot of rounds to get off in what would appear to be a short period of time.
I have not seen specific information about what kind of weapons were used, but we do know that there were many weapons that he had both at home and in the vehicle. So he presumably was, well armed. And if in fact there was a lengthy list of targets, you have to assume that there was ample ammunition that he intended to use over the course of that night.
Okay.
I mean, just
Go ahead.
to go back to your point about the availability of arms and like security, just as context for like, I was overseas. I met the Queen, which is like a whole different episode. But
Yeah,
like
you're gonna sneak that into this terribly sad
it's relevant.
episode
It's
about how
relevant.
awesome it was
Relevant.
that you met the Queen.
Let me
All
finish
right,
my
fine.
point. It's relevant because I arrived where I was supposed to meet the Queen with a backpack. And like an American, I was immediately like, oh my God, everyone, I have a backpack. What do we do with it? And later, like I was talking to one of my publishers, she was like, why were you so overwrought about the backpack? And then I was like, because I'm American and you're not allowed to have a backpack. You're like a head of state. Like you can't even go to a concert without like a clear tote bag. And she was like, oh. And then I was like, oh, it's because of guns. I am weird about carrying my own backpack in regular spaces because of guns. And so I just assumed that like I couldn't, and no one else was worried about this. No one was worried about it.
Yeah, and like I'll tell you, the very first time I went to the Capitol when I moved to Minnesota in 2022, pardon me, I was struck that there's no metal detectors, no security screening to get into the Capitol. When I went to, shake hands with the governor early on in my tenure here, and when I've gone to see the attorney general or go to meet lawmakers, it is not a heavily fortified space. It is very different than for instance walking into the US Capitol or a federal building where you do have to go at the very least through a metal detector. So just on that front, I think there's a recognition that greater security may be in order in a city and in a state where there's long been a presumption that it was unlikely that people like them and elected officials like them were could be targets. On the other hand, there's always been kind of an ease of finding out where your elected representative lives. So when they file paperwork to run for office, they need to disclose where they live to make sure they're eligible to run it in their district, and those are public records. So I think now, as people absorb the shock of what has happened, there's also a lot of conversations about whether there should be broader and, kind of better layers of security protecting them from people who may do them harm.
And just as a point of fact for our listeners, like Minnesota is, correct me if I'm wrong here, Ernesto, but Minnesota is a conceal and carry state.
Yep.
So like on my campus, for example, they'll say things like no arms on these premises. This is often posted on restaurants, etc. And when I moved here, I was like, the last time I saw this posted on a building was like in northern Sri Lanka on a nonprofit's door, where it's like really a sign for like militants. Right. And so, but it's also here because it's a conceal and carry state. So that's the other bit of context. Sorry, Whitney, go ahead.
Well, I just was going to say that, one of the reasons why you don't have security details around state legislators is that there's, we have had a history of violence, a national political figures that is sad, but stretches way back. But I was looking, I did a little research here. The last time a state senator was killed was in 2015, and that was the Dylan Roofs attack on Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, which wasn't directed at that state senator, it just happened to be there. And before that, you have to go back to a guy named Bill Gwatney, who was in the Arkansas State Senate, who was shot by a disgruntled employee, which really also had nothing to do with his political work. And then Tommy Burks in 1998, a member of the Tennessee State Senate, was killed by his opponent. So that was an actual, but this just doesn't, in our history, this is very rare. And the localization of that kind of violence to me is what's different and new in many ways about this. You reported, as we mentioned in your bio, on wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. I reported on Iraq as well as serving as a correspondent in Brazil. You were born in Bogota. In your experience, how common is this? The assassinations of really local officials like this, not national officials, in other places and in other times. And what do these killings tell us about the state of democracy in the U.S. now, if anything?
Yeah, I've actually been thinking quite a bit about my upbringing in Colombia this week because, unfortunately, when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, this was pretty common there. Politicians, journalists, activists were all fair game in a very messy war. Um, and, I think we all know political assassinations are not new in the United States. There's been political violence here dating back decades. We've, had a president who was gunned down. But I would say this is really kind of shattering a sense of what was reasonably safe in the arena. And I think we're kind of starting to, come to terms with the fact that political violence is becoming a growing reality at all levels in our country. We had two presidential assassinations last year, targeting Trump when he was on the campaign trail, one that came dangerously close to blowing out his brain. We had a really scary arson attack targeting the governor of Pennsylvania recently when he was in his home. We had, of course, the attack against Nancy Pelosi's husband in their residence. So I think, elected officials across the country kind of looking at this pattern are asking themselves, what are my defenses like and how do I bolster them? At this candlelight vigil I went to on Wednesday, you had a bunch of elected officials. You had members of Congress. Congresswoman Angie Craig was there, and she was kind of working the crowd and hugging people, but she was flanked by two very kind of big and burly bodyguards dressed in black who were watching her like a hawk, and like a ticking bomb was about to go off. And I just remember feeling really sad about that scene and what that told us about our politics and kind of the environment and the hyper awareness with which local officials now have to conduct themselves out in public.
I want to ask one more thing about kind of the consequences of Melissa Hortman's assassination before moving on to talk about Vince Bolter as a person. And that is, right, like this has a specific like electoral consequence, right? Like, which is that the legislature, right, like our local bodies were set up in a certain way. And now, like, in addition to the great grief of mourning her as like a person, as a public servant, her seat now has to be filled. Can you tell us anything about what, like, does he get what he wanted? Like, is this, and then what actually happens now to the seat that she spent her life trying to help people, trying to fill this office, and this office is now going to have to be filled by someone else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one important piece of context here is if you kind of, take a step back and look at the political reality in Minnesota, you have a really, really closely divided legislature. And in the House, in particular, voters left that chamber evenly split, which is pretty unusual. So there was even a big fight early this year about who would be the speaker and who would kind of wield control of how the chamber operates procedurally. And that was the time when Melissa Hortman brokered a deal by which, even though they were evenly split, she said that the senior Republican in the House should get a chance to be Speaker for the next 2 years. So because the legislature wrapped up its session this year and they passed a budget and all the bills that we're going to pass this year, nothing active is happening in state lawmaking right now. So procedurally, what would happen is at some point the governor will convene a special election to fill her seat. Her seat is widely regarded as a very safe Democratic seat. And I think the operating assumption is that somebody will be elected to fill her seat before the legislature reconvenes next year for a new session. So like the political implications to this are negligible in terms of like, does it give one party more power than the other? I think it kind of like will keep the status quo. The question, though, I think in the longer term is, how many state lawmakers who are really shaken by this will decide, I've done enough, I've served enough, I'm out of this. Like, what kind of people will be attracted to politics in this day and age to serve in jobs that, have long paid very, very little and been very, very demanding and are now kind of presumed to be a lot more dangerous than people thought.
And I'm just going to say, since I don't think we've said this specifically, and I think people know this in general, that both of these politicians, Representative Hortman and Senator Hoffman, were Democrats, right? And that's part of this story. So we're going to move on to this assassin and the reaction to this event. What do we know about Vince Bolter as a person prior to this assassination attempt?
Yeah, we are still trying to get a sharper portrait of who this guy was and if he, in fact, carried out these killings, what the motivation was. But I'll give you a little bit of what we know. We know he is a devout evangelical Christian. We know that he voted for President Trump last year. And we know that he was adamantly opposed to abortion, which may be relevant considering some of the targets on this list were abortion providers. We know he was a Second Amendment supporter and had many firearms and often went to the range to practice. Work-wise, we know he worked in several jobs in the food services industry as a manager. And at one point in that capacity, he had been appointed to a state board where business owners and entrepreneurs advise state government leaders about workforce issues, legislative priorities, et cetera. More recently, he had been spending time in the Congo in Africa, where he had an affiliation with an evangelical church that hosted him. And there's videos of him delivering these very fiery sermons where he rails against some changing norms in the US, including on gender issues, saying some people in the United States no longer know what gender they are. And where he also accuses American churches of going soft on abortion, of not really having a clear and strong stance against abortion. We know he's married and has children. He had a primary residence in a rural area that is roughly an hour away from the Twin Cities. But he had been renting a room in a house in a working class neighborhood in Minneapolis more recently. And one of his roommates there was a man who identified himself as a childhood friend. His name is David Carlson. And David Carlson told me that Bolter had been in somewhat of a downward spiral recently, that he'd been struggling professionally and had been kind of in the early stages of trying to set up a private security company, but that had been challenging. And that also emotionally, he hadn't been doing well. More recently, he had been working for a funeral home where his responsibilities included collecting bodies from the morgue. And it was in that role that he decided that he needed kind of a place to spend the night in Minneapolis. So we started renting this room over the past couple of years. And then early on, the authorities described a manifesto in his documents, but then, later kind of revised that to say they found a notebook full of notes and names and addresses. But we don't get a sense that there was kind of a conventional, this is why I carried out the shooting rationale that he left in writing, as some other mass shooters have in the past. What we do know from the federal court documents that were filed after he was arrested was that in the early mornings of Saturday, while he was fleeing from the authorities, he sent a text message to his wife in which he said, "Dad went to war last night." But we really don't know what that means. And unless and until he decides to tell his story and his motivation, it may remain, a foggy picture for the time being.
And I'm going to say alleged assassin, which I said when I said you were very careful about that. It's true. He's alleged to be the assassin. I'm sure you've seen social media posts highlighting that Bolter was, you mentioned that board. He was reappointed this board by Governor Walz, who's been previously appointed by someone else, and that Hortman had recently, this is one of the state representative who was killed, she had recently sided with the Republicans and voted for a bill that would take away free health care for adult illegal immigrants. And thus, have been said, and I'm hoping that's slowing down a little bit, that Bolter was somehow carrying out an assassination on behalf of Tim Walz and the Democrats. Is there any evidence at all of this? And how did this happen?
Gosh, no, I think this, is a wild conspiracy theory. And oftentimes in the aftermath of shootings, people connect very strange dots on Twitter to get attention. But there is absolutely no evidence that that vote on the question of whether undocumented people in Minnesota should be eligible for state-provided health insurance has any bearing on this shooting. And, to the extent that this is useful to understand, what happened here was the legislature was facing, a deadline to get the budget across the board. And if they didn't manage to do that, then they could have faced a shutdown. And there's a really contentious question of what to do about healthcare for undocumented immigrants, kind of stood in the way of getting the budget done. In the House, Representative Hortman became the only Democrat to vote in favor of this Republican-backed measure, which got it across the finish line, but not without a lot of pushback and heartache from her fellow Democrats. And it also passed in the Senate with a handful of Democratic votes, but among them was not Senator Hoffman. So there really is no clear sense that this was even, a thing or relevant in the assailants' thinking. And this was just kind of a separate thing that had been divisive and hard for lawmakers just days earlier.
So just as a little bit of context also for our listeners of again, what my experience of this was like in terms of being a person who's here and on social media is that, the security firm that he was working for was called the Praetorian Guard. And he cited, so this website is gone. It appears to me, because I've just been hunting for it and I can't find it. But my memory is that it not only mentioned the Democratic Republic of the Congo, but that it actually claimed, in it, he claimed to have spent time in Gaza. And that it was like a firm that was putting forward a very militarized, image. And so, I had people sort of say to me, he had a fantasy life of being in this sort of role, and it doesn't seem to have been the reality.
I've seen allusions to overseas missions that he undertook, but I think they may have been in the context of his faith and his interest in preaching, in sharing gospel. He appears to have self-published a book in 2006. We have been unable to find any trace of that book other than a website that is, many years old and has just very little information. But yeah, the extent to which he truly had the intention and the ability to create a private security enterprise with global reach remains very murky. His friend, the one who shared this house with him, said that he'd been interested in getting some business ideas off the ground in the Congo alongside his church interests. But by all accounts, he was struggling financially and he was struggling to get traction in his career, which is why he supposedly took this job at a funeral home. So these may have been ideas to, find some money-making opportunities abroad, but we've seen no real evidence that they materialized.
So he's got this ambition, and then there are these conspiracy theories on the other end of things. So we have other people concocting their own images of Bolter, and Utah Senator Mike Lee caught some headlines. He posted a picture of Bolter with the caption "Nightmare on Wall Street," spelled like the dance, but presumably a reference to our governor. Another picture of Bolter at the door of one of his victims saying, "This is what happens when Marxists don't get their way." He received a lot of flack and some in-person confrontations from his Democratic colleagues for this like extraordinarily insensitive and just like inhumane posting. Trump was asked if he was going to call Governor Walz, which, back in the day of any kind of decency and etiquette, would have been standard protocol, would have been like normal political etiquette. And he said, "I am not calling the governor because he's a mess." It's like, what's going on here?
I mean, I think the relationship between these two politicians, Governor Walz and President Trump, who faced off last year very publicly and dramatically on the campaign trail, is still really tense. And we have not seen an ability to kind of like walk off that very acrimonious and provocative rhetoric that we all became used to last year, to have a more civil conversation about what this tragedy means and how do we move forward together. The governor, I think, who is somebody who, has been somewhat inconsistent in his own approach to political discourse, at times calling for greater civility, and to kind of like, find ways to come together across ideological and political divides, has also shown a tendency to say pretty mean things and to even say Democrats need to learn to get meaner. And maybe that's what we, need to become better at. I think in recent days, we've seen Governor Walz really mourn, because I think he truly, truly had a close relationship with Melissa Hortman and valued her deeply as a lawmaker, but more importantly, as a friend and as a person who, did public service for all the right reasons. So I think he is taking a step back and really asking himself some really profound questions of, how do I want to speak about what has happened, and how do I want to conduct myself in the political arena going forward to lower the temperature on this? And, unfortunately, I think we're in an era where people still say and do really awful things in the aftermath of tragedies in which people look to leaders for solace and for guidance.
Yeah, well, Governor Walz having self-reflection is not going to fix Mike Lee. I mean, do you know if he's taken down those posts that he made about the shooting?
I am not 100% sure. I think I read that one or all may have been deleted after he got a lot of backlash, and that he may have issued kind of a more conventional statement denouncing the attacks. But his choice of words and their timing, I think, struck people as incredibly insensitive, even in this political era where anything seems to go.
Ernesto, thanks so much for joining us. We encourage listeners to follow his coverage of this story and many other stories in the New York Times.
Thank you so much. I hope I get to speak to the two of you about brighter issues down the line.
Let's do that.
We'll look forward to having you back for something else. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.